beginning of the book of Ruth that we're going through. And this week I want to pick up a little bit at the end of Elimelech's decision to leave the land of Bethlehem, known as the house of bread, and then go into Moab because of the famine that was in the land. And he thought that would be the right thing to do. And so there was a couple items I did want to cover, just mention. I thought it would be an interesting discussion. So I'd like to kind of a show of the hands. Now this is kind of a hard thing because it's almost like an open book test, right? But I want you to try to put yourself in Elimelech's place, not knowing what the result would be. But my question to the group, and we do this by a show of hands, how many people think that if you're Elimelech and there's a famine in the land and you've got two sons that are not really quite as healthy as they could be, their names suggest they're in poor health and things like that, how many of you thought it was a good decision for Elimelech to say, you know, I think we need to go to a place where at least the family can eat? So by show of hands, how many people think it's not such a bad decision? How many people think this is a terrible decision? You're leaving your kinsmen, people you know. You do have property here. They're in Bethlehem, Judah. So how many people think that's a really bad idea? Not a great idea. Show of hands for that. How many people, though, when you stop and think about it, we're going to talk about this a little bit, it comes later even in this chapter, that we look at believers also and we say, did you hear what the Marquitts decision was? I don't think that was such a great idea. I don't know what they're thinking over there. They should have done X and Y and Z. And Paul would call this later, in a very impolite way, busybodies. You see, you got your own little set of problems over here. But think about that in terms of our lives, that we look at other people in the truth or elsewhere and say, that's a bad person. That's a good person. We don't even know whether Elimelech is going to be in the kingdom or not. His name means, my God is my king. That's not a bad title. And he also was very well known in Bethlehem, Judah. So this is a high-profile person. This isn't just somebody sneaking out of the land. Everyone knew he was leaving. And so it's something for us to consider, even though we're looking at examples. And that's what this book is about too. Examples of life. That when we make decisions, we have to realize what those decisions are. And I want to go down another path. We'll talk about more of this in weeks upcoming when we get closer to the marriage of Ruth and Boaz. But the question is, how much input do you think Naomi had in this decision? Do you think that Elimelech came to Naomi, hey, do you think we should get up and leave? Like, was it a joint decision? Or did Elimelech say, no, this is the course of action that we need to do? And I'm going to interject something here. And I heard this, actually listened to the tapes of this many years ago. I don't want to say how long. Trust me, many years ago. And the brother was doing a series of classes. This is not in the United States, in another country. And he had a group of sisters, married sisters in the room. Later, he would have a group of married brothers in the room, young brothers. And what struck me in the tapes was the women, the married women, the sisters, said, oh, we really would like to marry American brother. Because, you know, American women think marriage is a 50-50 partnership. I don't like that. Because apparently there was some problem going on where the sisters felt that the husbands were making all the decisions and they didn't get the vote. And so that led me to an interesting discussion. By the way, you can see this all over. Go on the internet. You'll see this concept of partnership in marriage. So the question is marriage a 50-50 partnership? And also put that in the context of us being espoused to Christ? Is it a 50-50 partnership? Do we get a vote, in other words? So if you have any comments or you want to talk to me later or even now, think about that. Think about how equal or unequal is marriage. Both people bring something to the marriage. The question is, whose ultimate responsibility is it to guide the family? In this case, I would argue that Elimelech, the responsibility rests with Elimelech. By the way, the responsibility in the garden rested with Adam. That's what we call it Adam's sin and not Eve's sin. Adam was the responsible party here. That's what the Father said. You're responsible for what's going on. And yes, we know your wife disobeyed, but what'd you do? Well, I decided I would join them. Not good. Oh, we got a microphone up here.
The Hebrew word for helper, someone told me about this and I looked it up on the internet, is ezer, which signifies strength, aid, and rescue rather than a subordinate position. The word is used in Genesis 2:18 for the first woman, but is more frequently used in the Old Testament to describe God as Israel's ultimate helper, protector, and warrior. Therefore, when God uses ezer for both himself and the first woman, the concept is one of powerful, vital, and corresponding strength, not inferiority.
Both parties bring something, right, into the marriage, but responsibility rests obviously with the husband. He is responsible for the family.
I'm going back to your earlier question of what did Naomi think about all this. Judging by when they came back to the land, she thought that God had forsaken her. I think that she thought that if her children were sickly, as you were saying, that either she and Elimelech had done something wrong or God was displeased with them for some reason.
I think also, Brother Jerry, when you consider the society back in those days and the decision-making that was going on, I think it was heavily leaned towards the male member of the family where the decisions were made.
And I would also mention that in many other countries, that still is prevalent. The idea that the man dominates everything.
But considering Leanne's comment, where you're a helpmate, you're a strength, think about the children's names, weak and sickly. Maybe she had influence in wanting to take them to Moab, because if they stay, it doesn't do you much good to have all this land if you're all dead because there's a famine.
And we're going to talk a little bit about the land here in just a moment, because I think that's an interesting aspect, this decision-making process.
I think maybe this is tied in closely together. It's very arid land. They're on top of a mountain. If there's no rain, you're completely dependent upon the early and the later rains that come from God. Whereas Moab, on the other hand, would have been part of a well-watered valley. So there would have been some sustenance available at all times. And then when you go to this, like this next question that you ask, it's like, did he keep the land? Well, I don't think he kept any land because he was dependent, Ruth was dependent upon her near kinsman. So it must have reverted to other family members whenever they made the decision to leave.
Well, you'll see later, and I don't want to jump too far, of course we're jumping far ahead in our story, but it is about redeeming land when they're doing the levirate marriage, when Boaz is going to claim it, we need to redeem the land. And so this is another, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I thought this was a fascinating thing. And I won't name again, not here in the U.S., ecclesias in another country, who suggested for Elimelech, the land would be like an insurance policy. Or, as one brother suggested last week to me, maybe the thought was, we'll go into Moab for maybe a couple years, the famine will lift, I still have the land, we'll come back in, we're good, everything's fine. didn't turn out that way, that's what he thought. So the argument was, this many years ago, that believers shouldn't have any sort of insurance policy. God will take care of all of us, which he does. But life insurance, like that was the particular item. Having something like life insurance, like if I were to pass away, how is my wife going to live? Or do I say, well, I'm not going to worry about all that. That'll be up to the ecclesia now to solve that problem. And Paul talks about not being a burden to the ecclesians. So what do we think about this area?
Real quick, I was just going to say Romans 8:28 comes to mind when we look at this whole passage. Who's in the driving chair of all these people? It's God. And Romans 8:28 says, all things work for the good of those who love God. Did they love God? Yes. Why were they sent to Moab? Well, obviously, Ruth was a major component. She's listed in the genealogy of Christ. They were told not to intermarry with them for 10 generations. How long it had been? It had been 10 generations. So now it was okay. And they're plucking out of Moab probably the most spiritual woman of all the Moabites to become conjoined forever into the Jewish faith. So this famine, it's a bad thing. It's a horrible thing. What is it? Then they move to Moab. That's a bad thing. That's a horrible thing. But is it? He marries a Moabite. That's a bad thing, isn't it? No. She's brought in, and the end of the story is glory, glory, and more glory. It's win, 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 because all of them endured until the end. So even though they went through terrible patches in their lives, a famine, moving to a foreign country, marrying into a foreign nation, all of it was ultimately because God was watching them. He was actively part of their lives the entire time, even down to the death of Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion. You could say, oh, that's horrible. That's terrible. It's like God's got a bigger purpose than Eliakim. He's got a bigger purpose than Mahlon. He's got a bigger purpose than Chilion. I'm going to bring this faithful woman back to the land and create an empire from her. She's going to be part of the royal line of David.
What's interesting in our lives is, the question is, what is actually bad in our lives? Joseph said to his brothers, you threw me in the pit and sold me to Egypt. You did it because you were against me, but God did it for good. In other words, he looked at the whole situation totally different. Now, when Elimelech and Naomi are involved in this, they don't know the future of this. They don't know where this is going. They don't know if they're going to be in the land 2 years, 10, however long. They don't know. So they're making a decision somewhat on the unknown in terms of what the decision is. And by the way, this decision of Elimelech's is a big thing. I mean, it affects other people around you. Even decisions in the meeting, it affects other people around you. That's why it's so important.
Going back to the question about the land or whatever, was it an insurance policy or whatever the case may be? So he could more or less pawn that land, and it would return back to the family in Jubilee. And so that this idea of redeeming it was just an early redemption of the pawn, more or less, if you want to look at it in that way. But God had set those laws in order initially to keep them from selling their land.
Right, and here you think of the story of Naboth, okay, who Jezebel and Ahab wanted the vineyard, remember? He says, I can't sell it to you, it's my inheritance. Well, we know that story, how they decided to get it anyway. And it may be a case he couldn't sell the land at all. It could have been an inherited land, we don't know. But he doesn't, he keeps it there.
I'm going to take the opposite view of Joe. God told Isaac not to leave the land when there was a famine. And Abraham left the land when there was a famine, and he brought all kinds of trouble to his household. So it wasn't necessarily a good thing that they did that.
And we made the comparison last week. Elimelech's decision is a lot like Lot's decision. Lot said, now it's a little different in that Abraham said choose the land. And he goes down, he sees the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, he starts outside the city, works his way inside the city, very similar to what Elimelech does here. He starts outside of Moab, ends up more closely associated, and we know that, we're going to see later, because of the marriages between the two sons. So again, the mindset is important here. It starts out, we make decisions, we start out with good intentions, and I think Elimelech, personally, starts out with a good intention in mind. He has no idea what actually is going to occur, though.
And I just think that's what's so beautiful is how many decisions do we make that are poor decisions? How many decisions do we make that, you know, the world or through normal eyes were wrong and bad choices, but God can still use those for good. Yes, as humans, we are frail. We make a lot of mistakes.
Okay, so again, this idea of whether Elimelech made the right choice, we'd almost have to put ourselves in his shoes at that time. We might say, no, stay in the land. But I don't know, you look at the kids, they're not, you know, this is not good. They're going to die here because there's a famine. And so he decides to get up and leave. The land stays, or some portion of it, and later is going to be redeemed, of course. But I want you to think about that in terms of the decisions of our lives. And we're going to see other decisions made here shortly that we're going to have to evaluate as well and say, as the writer says, these are examples to us in the Old Testament. These are examples of what people have done. You can sit back and look at this and say, okay, as we shared last week, this decision of Elimelech is not unique. It happens a lot, even in our lifetime today. Now here, I didn't anticipate you actually starting this discussion much later, but I think it's probably worthwhile to start it early. Because we start getting into the death of the two sons, and we start getting into the subject of how old are these people. Now you may say this doesn't matter, but I think it is a big consideration, because it plays a role in the decision-making of Naomi, and also for her children. Now you see the very last bullet point there. The Talmud says that Ruth is 40 and Boaz is 80. I vote against that, but that's what the Talmud would say to you. But we see here that back in those times, women would have been married between the ages of 14 through 17. Now that's normal, mainly because of the age of life, how long people would actually live. And so they would marry young. And that makes you think, how old was Mary when she had Jesus? Was she somewhere in this age group as a teenager, let's say? Which is remarkable that the angel would call her at such a young age and say, you are chosen to give birth to the Son of God. Now, everyone can do the math here, but all of this is really implied stuff. You almost have to pick up bits and pieces along the way of the story to kind of figure out how old are these people. So you can read up on the board here of what I put. But it would appear that the two sons were probably teenagers themselves. In having them, if they were older than that, they might have made their own decision. Once they get up there to age 20, they're free to do it. They could have stayed, they could have done whatever. But they were probably somewhere in that age as teenagers, and there's a reason for that later. So really what happens is, it would appear that Naomi is about 30 years old or so, somewhere in that range, when they leave to go to Moab. And Elimelech is going to die. We don't know how soon he dies. Because we're going to make that, it says he dies, and then of course the children carry on. But we don't know that.
You may have covered this before, so forgive me if you've already covered this. Are we supposing that this famine was sometime in the book of Judges? Before Samuel, obviously. But I just was wondering what time period.
We're in the book of Judges. The times of the Judges. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. I assume that Ruth is a story that comes out of the time of
Yes.
Judges.
Yeah, it's it's a time period between Samson and then King Saul. Somewhere and some say the death of Samson, up till King
there were-
Saul is going to take over.
There are recorded famines in there, so I just
Yeah.
didn't know which recorded
I
famine
mean, I don't think we
specifically.
can pick a time, but we can get a sense here of the famine. And as we pointed out last week, yes, there was a physical famine, but as Amos said, yeah, the other famine was they weren't listening to God. And that was the other famine, the word of God they missed.
Right.
That was a worse problem than the physical problem.
So they physically, Elimelech would have said, okay, we're going to move to Moab, which is to the east, and we're going to put our land up for sale for the number of years of crops until we come back.
Could be.
So I guess he had to like pick a time and say, okay, we'll be back in 40 years, we'll be back in 20 years, we'll be back in 10. But it couldn't have been very long, I would
Yeah, I
guess.
think he expects a shorter time frame. One would not expect the famine to go for 10 years, right? You wouldn't expect that. Of course, we did have, like, in our own country, the Dust Bowl, that was for 7 years, things like that.
Right.
But he's making a decision, but he's also, because he's got the land still back there, he always knows he can go back, right? There's a way to go back for him. He's leaving an opening for himself. And again, this man is well known in Israel. Elimelech is not a minor figure in Israel, especially with the relation, his general family background. But anyway, on this time chart here, she's about 30. Elimelech dies, I'm saying soon after they get the land. We don't know that for sure, but we're going to make some guesses here, because we find out that Mahlon and Chilion marry then Moabites after the death of Elimelech. And they dwell in the land, it appears, 10 years after that. That now makes Naomi 40 years old. And now Ruth and Orpah are going to come out of, well, they don't both go out, but are going to leave the land of Moab, and they're each about, let's say, 25 years old. Okay? Naomi's going to tell them, in verse 12, I'm too old to have children. And so if she's about 40, she's saying, I can't have any more children. By the way, about 26 years ago, I would have agreed with this, but I was wrong. So I would have told you that 26 years ago, that if you're over 40 years old, you're not having children. Until I got a phone call that informed me that's not exactly what happened. So keep that in mind. She believes I'm too old. This gives you an idea of the age of people involved here. And that Naomi, that Ruth, is being 25 years old, and still, and we're gonna look at this a little later, of the discussion that Naomi is going to have with Ruth and Orpah about what to do. It's a big decision now because Elimelech is gone, her sons are gone. It's a very, very sad situation. And so she's, if you're in the position of Naomi now, you have to make a decision what to do. Are you going to stay in Moab? And by the way, and that was quoted there by just a moment ago, there in Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4. Well, let's turn that up and get a reader. I didn't put no, I did put a slide on that. Hang on. So they're going to marry, the two sons marry Moabites. And this is reminding us of what happened with Samson. Now, this is a little different. Manoah and his wife actually visited by an angel to say, you're going to have a son. And only very few women an angel come to and say, you're going to have a child. So we see here in Judges, we have another family problem. We'll read that, Judges 14. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there was a young Philistine woman. And when he returned, he said to his father and mother, I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. And his father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? That's a really powerful discussion. I can only imagine what that family discussion looks like.
the amusing thing about this is their parents are like, can't you find a nice Jewish girl in the village? Why do you got to go traipsing after one of these pagan Philistines? Instead, the next verse, chapter 14, verse 4, says, but this was from the Lord to seek an occasion against the Philistines. So he's always got this proclivity for Philistine women. And it's,
Women's his problem.
oh, I know, but he never really gets any real pleasure out of any of it. They're always nagging him. They're always bothering him. And in the end, they wind up almost killing him twice. And so the point is that in the end, God uses this as the vein by which he frustrates the plans of the Philistines, even to the point where he loses the riddle. It gets loose, and he has to kill 30 Philistines to do that, and then killing, 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. It's all because his proclivity was God induced for whatever reason, and that's in Judges 14:4.
And that goes back to the point that was made earlier. God can use our bad decisions for good. He can change things in our lives that we can't. We can't forecast the future. We have to make our best, what we hope is our best decision at the moment. Now, in this case, the mother and father, Noah and his wife, are trying to convince Samson not a great idea here. And he says, I also like the way Samson says, go get her for me as my wife. Your job. Go get her. And by the way, parents did go down for the marriage. They didn't get married. But that raises another question. Because now Naomi is going to make a decision. It's our second decision, or we're only in the first verse of chapter 1. Naomi decides, okay, I've heard that the famine is lifted in Israel, in Bethlehem. I don't have a husband. I don't have my sons. I have my 2 daughter-in-laws. I'm going to go back to Israel. It's been 10 years. And we can read in fact, I would suggest that you read those verses there. Ruth 1. In fact, why don't we have someone read that? Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. Do we have anyone like to read? We'll raise a hand and we'll. Okay. I didn't put that up as a slide. It's to the verses.
Ruth 1, 6 to 14. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And she kissed them, and lifted up their voice, and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should say I have an husband also tonight, and should also bear sons. Would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her.
This is a very sad discussion. It's a very emotional discussion. We find here that Naomi's going to make a decision, but later in those verses, the word is used that she's very bitter for her daughter-in-laws. She's very sad she put them in this position now, because they have no husband anymore. She can't have children. And it's a decision that Naomi's making, because for kinsmen, things like that. But these Moabites are not members of Israel. Remember, Moab and Israel were not buddies, okay? They were not friends. And what she's talking about here, in terms of having another husband, in verse 11, she's talking about the levirate marriage. And I used to think that it meant something to do with the book of the Levites, but it's really the word lever, which means brother marriage. In other words, as we see in Matthew 22, you know, they said a man marries a wife, and then he dies, and the brother marries her, and then on and on. Who will be the husband in the kingdom? And Jesus said, that's not happening in the kingdom. But this idea that one of her kinsmen would marry Naomi, but Naomi says, I don't think so, because I can't have children, therefore we can't keep the lineage going, therefore there's no reason for a kinsman of Elimelech to marry me. Like, there's no point in this. And even, she says, if I have husbands for you, if you look up that word husbands, it's the same kind of idea, a weak and sickly husband. Same kind of husbands you got from Malian and Chile. Like, what? What are you going to stay and wait for this child, this boy, assuming we have sons, that this child, you're going to wait another 25 years and marry? Because keep in mind, if we're correct, that Ruth and Orpah are 25 years old. They're going to wait another 20 years. They're going to be 45 years old. And she's saying, this is, you know, Naomi's saying, the math's not going to work here. It's not a good thing. And so what she says, and she's very, very kind to her daughter. She's very close to her daughter-in-laws. You could tell because of them coming close and the crying and the whatever. And she says, you're going to have to go back to your land. Maybe you'll find a husband of your own people. And things will go well with you. You'll have children. And you can raise a family. But don't depend upon me, because it's not. And by the way, as was pointed out, and she says it actually there, as was quoted, hey, it's written in our law that we shouldn't make a covenant with Moab or the congregation of Moab for up to 10 generations. In other words, no Israelite, no Jewish man is going to look at you as a Moabite and say, I think it's a good idea to marry her. It wasn't a good thing. You're going to have a really hard time. There's a lot of problems. If you go into this land, you don't know the customs, you don't know the people, we don't worship the gods you worship, you're going to have it's going to be really, really hard. You're going to be all alone. You're going to be a widow in Israel, but a Moabite widow, not a Jewish woman. It's a big cost. And so she's being very honest here with the two of them. She's being very honest with Orpah and Ruth. Here's the cost. And now let's ask the question, what was our cost in coming into the truth?
Brother Jerry, I was thinking a couple of things. One, you mentioned the closeness, which I find quite interesting when you consider how, like, when Esau took a foreign wife and all the drama that ensued from that, how that was so upsetting to Isaac and Rebekah. So it's kind of counterintuitive, I think, that there would be this level of closeness between the three women. And then the other thing that I've always thought was quite staggering about the story was that neither Ruth or Orpah had ever had children. So, I mean, it's not only that you don't have Elimelech and you don't have these husbands, you have no offspring from either of these unions. So there is a level of, loss and emptiness here that's really deep.
Yeah, it's lineage and children is a big deal, because you had, one of the reasons, of course, why you had children is that they might take care of you in your old age. That was part of it, right? But lineage, especially in Israel, was a very big deal.
I had never heard or thought about the fact that Malin and Killian were weak or sickly, and it now clicks in my head, well, that's probably why they didn't have children. And then also, Naomi, like many mothers, like myself, feels a great responsibility for how their kids turn out, as you probably should to some degree, even though a lot of it's their own choice. But anyway, it seems to me that her bitterness comes from this sense that her kids did not turn out to be strong men who produced a long line, and she feels some kind of responsibility for that the Lord has turned against her in particular.
And it is, of course, we're going to see the contrast with Boaz, whose name means strength later on. Total opposite of Malin and Chilion. But in looking at this, that verse there in Deuteronomy 23 is a big issue for a Moabite. And what is Orpah and what is Ruth going to do with this? When we come into the truth, we leave a land. Actually, our first husband died, and we're going to come into a land looking for another, or with another husband in mind. But the cost is, and she's saying to Orpah and to Ruth, you're going to have to turn back on your own family. You're not going to be able to see your family again. They're not going to come here to Israel to visit you. You're going to be, and if I should die prematurely or whatever, you're all alone. There's no one to help you. You're a Moabite. Yes, you may be part of Elimelech's inheritance, but you're alone. This is it. There is no other kinsman to take care of you.
Last point on that is there was only one kinsman redeemer, Boaz, who was going to be waiting for them in the wings. So it's almost like they had to go through this final test to see who was truly dedicated in the scenario, and it's Ruth. And she's the one who's going to be Boaz's future, and likewise the other way around. And it's to me, it's also a matter of inheritance. Like, we are God's inheritance, and He is ours. And when you think about it in those terms, then it all fits together quite beautifully.
Right, and we're coming here closer to the end, so go ahead.
Two quick questions. One is, we look at Moab from Israel's perspective. How would Elimelech's family have been perceived by the Moabites, particularly to marry these two sickly Israelite kids? So what was going on with Ruth and Orpah from that perspective? Number two, I thought it was interesting, I'd never noticed before, Ruth says, go back to your mother's family. Go back to your mother's home. Just thought that was interesting.
Right, and the word there that they died, where it says Malin and Chilion died, that word means died prematurely. Some have suggested they died in a battle or something. No, I think they died prematurely, mainly because of their, we'll call it their health condition, whatever. These are weak men. And there was, I mean, what Naomi is painting for her daughter-in-laws, if you come with me, it's a rather bleak-looking future. Like, I can't guarantee you anything in terms of that. I'll put this slide up now. We're not going to have much time to discuss it, but I want you to think about it. These are big decisions, even when we come in the truth. For some of us, we actually did leave families. Some who come into the truth, their prior family, maybe won't speak with them or won't be with them. And so it's a consideration of counting the cost. What is the cost of discipleship? What is the cost? And the two Moabite women, have to evaluate which direction am I going to go in my life? What am I willing to give up and what am I willing to get? And they don't know. We have no idea what happened to Orpah. We don't know if she's married. We're not told. Although Orpah's name means turning of the neck, which means she turned back. This reminds you a lot of what King Agrippa said. Thou almost persuadest me to be a Christian. Almost. This is what this conversation is all about. You almost persuaded me, but I turned back. And so we'll talk more about Ruth and Orpah next week. Something to think about here of the two women, and just they're going to make their own decisions. There are decisions everywhere in this book. So we have to evaluate that in our own lives. Say, what decisions are we making in our lives? And yes, there's a cost to making those decisions that we could actually benefit from. The Lord will in the future. We'll stop there.